The 6 women who married King Henry VIII and became the wife of the most infamous king ever to rule England all had their lives made worse by their husband. 2 of the women lost their heads inside the Tower of London, becoming victims of the man who they married, and others died in misery. Henry VIII changed the face of his kingdom forever, and still his legacy is felt today. But in the centuries following the Tudor period, the wives of the king, Henry VIII, and his queens had their graves and tombs broken into, and many of these had their remains actually desecrated. For example, the final wife of King Henry VIII, Catherine Parr, even had her skeletal corpse danced with, and it was then tossed to the side and left out of her tomb to rot for some time, and people even cut pieces of the Queen's hair. But why did King Henry VIII's wives get dug up? And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The first of the 6 wives of King Henry VIII was Catherine of Aragon. She was the woman who gave the king his daughter Mary, the future Queen Mary I, or Bloody Mary. Catherine was forced out of the royal apartments after Henry VIII's eye was caught by one of her ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, and Catherine refused to go down without a fight, and Henry VIII had to break from Rome to deal with her and divorce her. But Catherine spent a lot of time following her banishment, practically held under house arrest. She was not allowed to see her own daughter. But following her death, Catherine of Aragon was buried inside of a tomb within Peterborough Cathedral. She was laid to rest in the aisle close to the altar, and her coffin is still in the ground today. However, her tomb is not. She was given a tomb, and it's believed that this was a chest tomb. She was buried with the honours of a king's sister, as she was married previously to King Henry VIII's brother, Arthur. But throughout the English Civil War, there were a number of attacks by parliamentarian forces upon symbols of monarchy, and there were a number of graves and tombs which were desecrated. People had, in the days following Catherine's death, mourned her, but during the Civil War, the soldiers of Oliver Cromwell, his parliamentarian forces, ransacked Peterborough Cathedral, and they destroyed and vandalised the original tomb of Catherine of Aragon. Because of this, a replacement memorial slab was placed over the site of her burial. But her tomb was destroyed because of the Civil War, and as a symbol of the monarchy, she was targeted as she was once a Queen of England. The woman who stole Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon was Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn is probably the most famous of the 6 wives. She caused a significant amount of trouble across England, along with her husband, but she is best remembered for her execution and death. Anne was a victim of her husband, and she was accused of incest, treason, and adultery, false charges, so the king could get rid of her, and then he could marry his mistress, Jane Seymour. Anne was executed inside the walls of the Tower of London by sword, and following this, she was then buried inside of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Her remains were buried close to the high altar, and over the centuries following her death, there were many other burials near to her. Some who were executed on Tower Hill, and also normal citizens who attended the church. But then, on the 19th century, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was in a bad way. It needed repairing, and because of this, the floor was lifted by builders, and they discovered a number of skeletal remains belonging to important Tudor figures. It was said of the bones of Anne that the bones found are clearly those of a female in the prime of her life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull with an intellectual forehead, a straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest, and the hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. Queen Victoria's doctor said that Anne would have been roughly 5 foot to 5'3" when she was alive, and he confirmed that indeed a sharp weapon had been used to take her from her body. He also claimed that she had a small neck, the same small neck that, according to contemporary Tudor accounts, Anne had. The remains of Anne were taken outside of the chapel, and they were stored inside of the Queen's house, in the corner opposite, a number of months whilst the building work took place. They were then sealed up inside a new lead coffin, and copper plates were placed on top, identifying which remains belonged to who. So Anne's grave had been opened as the church she was buried inside of was in a bad way, and it needed repairing. She was then reburied and still remains there today. Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, who died following giving birth to King Edward VI, Henry's successor, is buried today inside of Windsor Castle St George's Chapel. She is interred in a coffin which is said to have been in good condition compared to Henry's, and she's laid to rest inside of a vault. But her coffin has never been opened, but the burial vault has. The reason this has been disturbed over the centuries is because other people she is buried with. Also inside of the vault is King Charles I, and to accommodate the executed king's remains, Jane Seymour's coffin was moved to the side. So Jane's burial vault was opened because of the interest around Henry VIII and King Charles I, who are laid to rest next to her. Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife, is buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and she's interred at the heart of Westminster Abbey. Her tomb and coffin have never been opened. The fifth wife of King Henry VIII was Catherine Howard, and the fate of her corpse and body after her death is tragic. She is remembered in history for being the teenage wife of the notorious king who cheated on the king with his close friend. Because of this, Catherine was taken to the Tower of London in the prison, and she was locked up there, being shown under London Bridge the heads of the men that she allegedly had relationships with. But Catherine was executed by axe within the walls of the Tower of London. Like Anne Boleyn, she was carried into the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula within the tower's walls to be buried. She was placed in a grave in the ground, and her body was covered in a shawl. On top of her remains was then a copious amount of quicklime upon the orders of Henry VIII. He wanted to decay Catherine Howard's remains off the face of the earth. It was like the king wanted to rid himself of the mistake of his fifth marriage, and almost as if Catherine had never existed. The remains and corpse of Catherine Howard was searched for when the renovations took place to the chapel that discovered and uncovered the remains of Anne Boleyn, but despite the intense search, there was never any bones found of Catherine, just a small collection of skeletal matter covered in lime near to the remains of prominent Tudor women, such as Margaret Pole. These, it were considered, may have belonged to Catherine Howard, but this has never been proven. So her grave was opened for the same reason as Anne Boleyn, but her remains were never found. The sixth wife of Henry VIII was Catherine Parr, and she had a horrific ordeal following her death. Catherine's remains were subjected to a terrifying amount of desecration. She was buried inside of the church in Sudeley Castle, close to the very rooms where she died. But during the English Civil War, her tomb, like Catherine of Aragon's, was destroyed and desecrated, and it was reported that there is in the castle a goodly fair church. Here they dug up the graves and disturbed the ashes of the dead. So Catherine Parr's remains may have been dug up for the first time then, during the Civil War, as she was seen as a symbol of monarchy. But then in the 18th century, a local farmer opened the grave of Catherine, and it was claimed that in the summer of the year 1782, the earth in which Q.K. Parr lay interred was removed, and at the depth of about 2 feet, or very little more, her leaden coffin was found quite whole. Mr. Lucas had the curiosity to rip up the top of the coffin, expecting to discover within it only the bones of the deceased, but to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloth linen, entire and uncorrupted. His unwarranted curiosity led him to make an incision through the cerecloth which covered one of the arms of the corpse, the flesh of which at the time was white and moist. Repeatedly, the coffin of Catherine Parr was then opened a number of times, and during this, pieces of her dress that she was buried in, and also locks of her hair were cut from her. Also, at one point, the body was found to have been reduced to a skeleton, and the coffin had been filled with ivy, and some drunk people even allegedly danced with her remains. So her remains were disturbed for curiosity purposes and for nothing but desecration. And this continued for centuries after her death. But today she is interred inside of a new tomb. So the remains and coffins of King Henry VIII's wives were opened, and it was incredibly rough what happened to them in the centuries after their deaths. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.